So let me then offer an introduction. So I welcome you, Jeff, to the CCA and to the developing room for our seminar, engaging with your new book, Negative Positive, and a draft of a Talbot paper as well. So Professor Geoffrey Batchen is a renowned photo historian who has worked on topics and problems in the medium, ranging from photography's origins all the way to our current conditions of rampant social media inundation. He has fundamentally shaped the way we now understand photography as, among other things, a conception mediated by metaphors, cultures, social conditions, and desires. Batchen has employed this same sort of thinking to explore the implications of the dissemination of photography's identity, or dissemination as part of photography's identity, and the presence of a nearly phantom photographic that expands well beyond the traditional print itself and characterizes the perception of such things as woodblock engravings of photographs and even drawings of the same. Another one of his most important contributions has been the category of vernacular photography, which he both devised and more recently renounced. We can talk about that at greater length. And he, in fact, Batchen welcomes questions on his larger body of scholarship in this seminar. So Professor Batchen is professor of art history and head of department at Trinity College, Oxford University. After teaching for many years in the United States, including at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, Batchen returns regularly to our region of the country to speak at symposia and colloquia, and now he'll lead this seminar on his book, Negative Positive. So please welcome our guest, whom I'm proud to call a good friend, Geoffrey Batchen.
Thank you so much. It's very nice of you to read all that stuff out, and it's always strange to be introduced like that because it sounds like a stranger. That's like, who did produce all that stuff? It's like way too much. It's very nice of you to have me. I think it might be either the third or fourth time I've spoken under the umbrella of the developing room. So it's been very nice of Andres in particular to invite me back. And it's very nice of all of you to be present. And it's especially nice as an author to have readers. So I'm very grateful to Andres for forcing so many of you to actually read parts of this book and thereby exponentially increasing its readership in one fell swoop. So that is the greatest gift that an author can receive. So what I thought I would do is sketch out, you might say, the general frame in which this little book appears, at least its ambitions from an author's point of view, and then invite questions and comments, and hopefully it will generate some sort of conversation. As Andres says, I'm happy to take questions about pretty much anything within my sphere of interest. So we can begin from this book and move outwards or backwards, wherever you like, really. So it's an odd sort of a book, really. As Andres mentions, I have a few books to my name, including a previous anthology of my essays. And that previous anthology basically did what most anthologies do. It gathered together past essays. I slightly reworked them, but there they were, sort of like ducks in a row in a book, and hopefully people found them of interest. And when I came to this point in my career, I thought I would do it, but do it differently. I'm very interested now, having published a few books, to try and publish different kinds of books, explore, if you like, the genre of book publishing. And so this one, I tried to reconceive and do something different than I did with Each Wild Idea. So this is a book that encompasses many different ambitions in a single volume. For a start, indeed, it's yet another anthology of my writings. At least 25 of my existing writings brought together into this particular volume, going back as far as 1993. Sometimes whole essays are reproduced as single chapters, but more often what you will find are fragments of existing essays rewritten and joined together with new segues and with new bits of research stuck in as well. That composition is devoted to a sort of thematic study. When I was putting the essays together, when I was thinking, I should put some of my essays together, it seemed to me that, in fact, when looking back, they had a sort of common interest. I came to sort of argue that that common interest has to do with the negative, the functions and effects of the negative in the history of photographic practice, and indeed in the history of photographic history. And when I began to look around, it seemed that the negative had received relatively little attention from scholars. Indeed, often it seems to have been ignored or even seemingly deliberately suppressed from historical accounts of photography. So when I was looking around, although there's a footnote attached to that first chapter, which lists some of the existing books that have addressed the negative, there are relatively few of them, as it turns out. And there are very few that look at the implications of the negative, that actually consider the negative as a kind of structural part of photography, and then trace the various implications and effects of that structure. And that's what this book, therefore, set out to do. One of the primary consequences of the negative positive system within analog photography, perhaps within all photography, is that it allows for the multiple reproduction of photographic prints, but also for their enlargement and reduction in size, for the division of authorship. One person might expose a negative, another person might actually turn that negative into a positive print. And that allows for a temporal gap between the exposure of a negative and the making of a photograph, and then often of the exposure of that photograph to a common gaze, to a public gaze. So it creates all sorts of complications looking at the actual role of the negative within the history of photography. In other words, as Andres has already suggested, this new book is a logical extension of my previous book about photography's dissemination through copies and reproductions. So it's a book about the negative, but it's also a book about reproductions and photographic reproduction. This thematic focus also allows this book to be a rumination on the racism and sexism within the discourse of which it is a part. It demonstrates how the negative has been consistently associated with Blackness and the feminine, and thereby with promiscuity and fears of impurity, and it's treated accordingly. The book proposes that racism and sexism is built into the very infrastructure of photo discourse and must be addressed there as much as in the content of that discourse. Fifth, and perhaps most provocatively, is the book's subtitle, claiming it to be a history of photography, despite the book being relatively small and making no obvious effort to be comprehensive. You might say then that the book attempts to offer a critique of what a history of photography might look like or even be like. As I've written quite a few essays about the challenges of writing such histories, I tried to make mine responsive to my own criticisms of others. This event is a chance for you all to say how I've fallen short of that, perhaps. So the book is global in perspective. It's achronological and yet also logical in its structure. It's diverse in its interests, including both vernacular and fine art examples, if those distinctions, Andres, can still be held. And it allows regional voices, and in particular, the photography of my own places of origin, Australia and New Zealand, a seat at the historical table where they are usually not given a seat. Most importantly, it tries to be a history about photography rather than simply of photographs. It's not about originality, it's not about rarity. Although there are some great artists in it, it's not really about great artists, it's certainly not about their biographies. It's about photography and the way that photography functions in the world. The book also sets out to emulate its own subject by being structured like a photograph, something I've argued about Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, for example. And I've always been interested in the idea that books about photography might actually be attuned to their own possible photographicness. And so this book I did try and think about that as I was putting this book together. It's like a photograph if you take photographs to be, for example, combination prints, one of those practices that negatives make possible. So here we have a combination print with the joins between the parts carefully blurred with India ink, you might say, in the segues that I've added to the book. And finally, the book manifests my ongoing interest in the marginal and the overlooked, an effort to dislodge the prejudice against the other that, in my view, has long confined scholarship in the history of photography. So the book includes a number of genre studies: street photography, memorial cabinet cards, hidden mother photographs, snapshots with shadows, and so on. And indeed, the draft that some of you will have read, my little proposed book about Talbot's experimental test prints, is another example of the marginal and the overlooked within his oeuvre that I am now trying to bring into the center, if you like, bring to the fore. So the book tries overall to demonstrate an expansive view of our field and its potential interests. And it attempts to show that the criticality of a photograph is to be found as much in how it is spoken about as in its own inherent pictorial properties. So I'm very much looking forward to getting some feedback from people who've actually read this book or parts thereof. I'd be very happy to answer any questions about it, and indeed to discuss anything related to the history of photography that people might want to raise.
So I have a question, Jeff, about, yes, the book, and it has less to do with the details of the histories that you gave in chapters 1 and 17, but instead something that I found toward the end of your Talbot draft. And I think that reflects on what you're doing with the book. And I wanted to ask you about this. So toward the end, you say about Talbot's experimental strips, these photographs are self-declared as made rather than taken. In other words, they argue against the prevailing conception of photography as a medium devoted to the automatic capturing of images of a world outside of itself. So my question is, first, a little bit more precisely, are you suggesting that we should stop calling photography a medium or only do so cautiously? And then secondly, does your history of the negative continue this inquiry into what we identify photography to be, just as you have done with the case of these Talbot strips?
Let me answer the second bit first. One of the things I could have mentioned, one of the things about focusing on the role of the negative in the history of photography, it necessitates that you focus on labor, on the actual work of making a photograph, of exposing the negative and then taking it into a dark room and then producing a print, which often involves, in fact, making numerous experimental test prints of the sort that the Talbot manuscript reflects on. So that to me is another interesting element about this kind of way of thinking about photography. Indeed, it literally forces us to think about how things are made, but then it also makes us think about all of the issues related to the making of things, including labor practices, work, authorship, value, and all of those other related issues. And elements of all of those things are touched on in different parts of the book. Now, I'm not quite sure. You'll have to explain the first part of your question. How did that little extract from the Talbot suggest it shouldn't be called a medium?
Well, because you say, I should preface by saying I'm asking this because our inquiry this year is inspired by your earlier writing into photography's identity. And you say that those strips argue against the prevailing conception of photography as a medium. But then
as a medium in which which refers outside of itself. Yeah. No, that's an interesting way that you've read that. I mean, I'm happy to call it a medium, but there are people who do medium theory who probably want to tell me that that's not the ideal term. Phenomenon. I'm not too fussed about the word, really. Yeah.
That's good. That's great, because that already says quite a lot. Thank you for that.
Perhaps only about my definitional slackness.
Jeff, I want to follow up actually on a point that Andres has raised, and it sort of runs athwart what I take to be the sort of political argument that you're making in the book. And it's a current that I notice in all three of the pieces that we were asked to read, and it involves what I would describe as photography's falling away from something. It's apostasis. It's disavowal of a kind of originary moment that is vested initially in the negative, which seems to be linked in some ways to a representational function in the world, and becoming ever more a made and abstract thing. And so, I mean, there's a sense in which the end game of photography, at least on the evidence of these three pieces, seems to be about a kind of artistic autonomy that is, you know, is finding itself dispersed and removed from any kind of representation of the world. I mean, the various iterations of the negative take us further and further away from that originary moment. The images of children somehow, you know, disarticulated from any kind of social or maternal environment seem to be, you know, almost freestanding in their autonomy. They're also removed from any kind of sense of temporality. There they are, frozen in time. And last but not least, we have Talbot's early experiments, which seem to be virtual abstractions, meditations on their very process, you know, akin to a kind of abstract painting concerned with surface and flatness. So, I mean, a lot of this really, I mean, this, you know, is very, very much apart from questions of race and sexism, although I couldn't help but think of the whole narrative of passing and how that relates to the sort of whitening of the negative and what all that means. But for my part, I just felt that the sense of photography that I was deriving from these three pieces involved a kind of falling away from any kind of representational function and a kind of autonomy that became ever more abstract and removed and remote.
Well, you've practically written another book in your question there. So let me try and tackle some of it. As you probably are well aware, William, our field, the history of photography, has been driven by the notion of indexicality and what people presume that means for, well, certainly since I don't know when, at least Barth, but going way back. And it's very interesting to me that we have this constant conversation about this being photography's most essential fundamental element, its indexical quality. And yet nobody ever actually talks about its indexical part, which is that negative. People just seem to want to write about indexicality and then immediately ignore the negative and go straight to the print, which is of course merely an index of the negative, not of the world the print purports to represent. So right within the very infrastructure of photography, we have a kind of complication of the nature of indexicality. And what's interesting to me is why historians ignore it, have ignored it. Nobody ever seems to write about this sort of two-step process that complicates all these assumptions about indexicality and photography's privileged access to a world outside of itself. So as you suggest, when you actually do examine that relationship, you're saying a falling away, certainly a complication of the representational claims that photographs are often asked to make. And what's the other thing that's interesting to me about that is it's a claim that historians like to make, but I think if you talk to most photographers, and certainly when you examine their actual practices in any kind of detail, they have no illusions of the sort that historians often want to repeat. They're very aware of the constructiveness of photography. Richard Avedon, went out of his way, often to the point of painting in a border to remind us that this is a construction, this is the means of production, here's the negative or the enlarger marks still in the print and all of these kinds of things. And equally, Talbot obviously collected and kept all of these strange off prints, these experimental test prints. For him, they obviously were meaningful, and there was, he didn't hide them. Whereas I've never seen anybody write about them ever. So as far as the history is concerned, they're to be hidden. They're not to be spoken of. They're to be, kept in the darkroom and repressed. So if there's a falling away, to me, this is a discursive invention of people like us. And part of this book's function is to try and draw our attention back to what photography actually is and how it actually works. And then indeed, as I said before, the actual work that's involved in it. And this is where, of course, various politics come into play. So, there's a lot, your questions, there's a lot to be said about them. Let's say maybe we could summarize them by saying, in the end, is photography a form of abstraction or a form of representation? Maybe that's what you're really asking me. And I would have said that what this book tries to complicate is the presumed distinction between those two things. Yes, it does represent things in the world, but the how of that representation is something that we need to pay closer attention to and to acknowledge more honestly in our writings.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have some questions from members of the seminar, Michelle Smiley and then Will Green.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. I should probably say your work was completely foundational to my own dissertation work, so thank you.
So sorry about that. I hope you overcome that handicap and move forward.
Well, I mean, in that spirit, I guess, one of the, I mean, if I may, like, talk a little bit about that. I mean, part of what I looked at in my dissertation was the chemical prehistory of photography as that sort of repressed site of the labor of making the photograph that doesn't get talked about. So I was really intrigued by your Talbot essay, and I would love to know where we could see some of these pictures. I see you noted most of them haven't been reproduced, but so that's just, yeah.
If you look at the document, Michelle, every one of the images has a link.
Okay, good.
If you go to the end, there's a link, I think it's to the 24 images that I'm proposing the book will comprise, and they all go to the catalogue raisonné, the Talbot catalogue raisonné, which is hosted by the Bodleian Library here at Oxford and compiled by Larry Schaff, as the doyen of Talbot scholars. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the essay. There's two reasons. One is, it's at Oxford and they're quite keen that now that I'm here that I write something about what they've been doing. Secondly, I actually wrote that essay while I was in compulsory quarantine in a prison cell, that is at the hotel in Auckland, on my way to see my children in New Zealand. So what can you do when you're holed up in a hotel room for 2 weeks and not allowed out? You look online and there's a whole catalogue raisonné of images that no one seems to have written about. So one of the ideas behind that project is to just show you in a way what scholarship can do. Talbot made 20,000 images. Most of them are up there on the catalogue raisonné. So it's now open for a kind of historical curating, if you like. And what I propose to the Bodleian is that this little book that you've read should be something they do every year, and they should invite Salman Rushdie, and they should invite all sorts of different kinds of people who would all bring their own perspective and interests, and they too could curate 24 images out of the 20,000. So there might be a book about photography and labor, or Talbot's images of labor, or Talbot's images of women, or Talbot's botanical specimens, Talbot's architectural photography. I'm suggesting to them, this would be an interesting way to constantly draw attention to the catalogue raisonné. So that's what kind of drove it. And when you go to that catalogue raisonné, you'll find that Larry, who knows more about Talbot than Talbot knew himself, has given you as much information as he can. For example, about what chemicals he thinks Talbot actually used on what prints.
That's great. So I printed the essay, so I totally didn't see the links.
Yeah.
But I do have a question sort of about an expansive view on what a negative is in the history of photography, and particularly in the history of race and racial science and the way photo technologies are used to represent that. I was thinking about the portrait silhouette, and if that's a sort of negative image that could be drawn into this history, if not precisely photographic, maybe pre-photographic. And I was particularly thinking of the artist Carl Walker's use of the silhouette and her sort of shadow play. And also there's that Chuck Close daguerreotype of Carl Walker where she is presented in silhouette. And the second part of this question is also about the darkroom. And is there a way to think about the darkroom as a site of sort of play and liberation through reversal, as opposed to merely this kind of site of sexual and racial kind of metaphoric denigration, or real denigration in some cases? Okay,
so silhouette and darkroom as playroom. It's interesting you ask about silhouettes, because I have recently written an essay about daguerreotypes of engravings and paintings and things, and I've actually collected a couple of daguerreotypes of silhouettes. And they're particularly interesting to me because when you look at them, it's like you're looking through the metal because the silhouette goes black and it's like this void. It's like an Anish Kapoor in photographic form. It's a very strange perceptual experience. Now, it's interesting though, exactly, do silhouettes have a place in the history of the conception of photography? They do, I think, to the degree that they represent a further effort at automation and mass production and mechanization of portrait making, and therefore also point us to a sort of class interest in this, the emergence of a class who obviously can't afford paintings but does want portraits and so on. And that's obviously a context in which photography also emerges. But it's interesting that, when you look at early photographs, there are very few of silhouettes. There are some of profiles. So, that's obviously part of the genealogy, but very few of actual silhouettes. So it'd be interesting for somebody like yourself perhaps to do some further study and try and find out whether there is any direct link as opposed to a kind of conceptual coincidence between photography and the emergence of the silhouette machine. I'll give you another example. Find it difficult to find any English silhouettes. The Ashmolean has one, but I've had trouble finding any. It seems like to have been a very French phenomenon. Now, it sounds like it was an American phenomenon too, and obviously Kara Walker picks up on that. But whether it's an American phenomenon in the 1820s and 30s, I'd be interested to see somebody write something about it. I would say, other than Kara Walker, though, it's again one of those picture forms that relatively little scholarship has been published about, really. Most of what I've read about silhouettes has been online rather than in scholarly book form, if you like. Now, the darkroom. Yeah, it's another one of those parts of photography that hasn't been much written about, perhaps because those histories are usually written about by people like me who are not practicing photographers. An earlier generation like Beaumont Newhall and Helmut Gernsheim were themselves photographers and were, of course, extremely familiar with darkrooms and the techniques of photography. And now we have a generation, you might say, university-educated historians who are usually not photographers and who come out of a more literary background and therefore pay less attention to these practical elements. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that the darkroom has always been a place of play and creativity, and that creativity often involves making errors, deliberately making errors, or conducting experiments that they know may not come to anything, and certainly that the photographer would often destroy any evidence of. But I think, yeah, a lot could be said and written about the darkroom as a place of creativity. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think this book, which is really just a first step, opens up an awful lot of doors for other better scholars to step into and do some more work.
Will?
Hi, my name is Will. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at Rutgers and a CCA graduate fellow this year. And thank you so much for joining us. I had a question regarding your recent article on Talbot's experimental photographs. When I was reading through it, I was especially interested in the 20th century and contemporary examples that you drew upon toward the end of the paper. And it seems to me that there is this kind of desire to make the medium visible that recurs at different moments throughout the history of photography.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if you would think that these photographers during these moments are trying to kind of step back in order to reset the medium and start fresh, or if there's something else going on in their desire to kind of look at photography. And also, is this desire a reaction to technological changes, or are there other kind of social and political aspects that kind of fuel it and that we should be thinking about? Thanks so much.
It's a good question, William. And I have written something to that effect once myself, that photographers turn back to a sort of primeval engagement with the medium at moments of crisis, just as you've suggested. But the thing is that when I, for example, put together Emanations, the history of the cameraless photograph, if that argument is to hold up, you'd have to say then that the medium has been in crisis since its inception, because it's hard to find a decade or even a year in which some photographers, many photographers, are not precisely returning to these fundamental practices of the sort that the little Talbot essay points to. So it'd be really interesting if you could locate a sort of, a wave graph or something that suggested crisis, 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 and then we find a whole influx of photographers working on these fundamental aspects of photography. But I suspect you'll find that photographers of ambition have always returned to these fundamentals and tried to think them, if you like, sometimes making work and sometimes merely playing in the darkroom, as Michelle suggested before. Now, I think though where your question's coming from is the possibility that the number of ambitious photographers working, going back to analog process and analog practice at the moment is a response to the advent of the digital, and that there's a sort of crisis in the medium, and that's what's driving these photographers. I have to say I've spoken to quite a few photographers who work like that, and they claim to have no conscious, sense of crisis of the sort that I've just described. So I mean, you can't ever believe anything artists tell you, of course, and what would they know? But they claim to not be responding to the crisis of the digital. They pointed out they were making work like this before the advent of digital cameras, and they've been making work since, and it's just the kind of work that they're interested in doing. But I think what's more interesting, of course, is what we can make of such work. So in this Talbot essay, one of the things I'm trying to do, of course, is to drag things that Talbot was doing into the 1830s into the present and make us look at them, you might say, with the same respect, with the same intellectual openness that we might if I had told you these same prints were made by a contemporary artist. This is something that I often find with people who write about Talbot. They come to him properly as social historians, and they want to put him back in the 1830s and 1840s. Fair enough, that's indeed when he was working. Whereas I'm more of the type who writes, you might call it historical criticism. I'm interested in writing about Talbot's prints as if they had been made now. I'm interested in asking, what could they say to us now, as opposed to what they might have said to a viewer in the 1830s or the 1840s. So in this case, of course, I was struck when I was looking through the catalogue raisonné while lying on my bed in my tiny little hotel room in Auckland. I was struck when I saw all of these experimental test prints that even Larry has never really done anything with or referred to. I mean, for a start, I was amazed how many of them there were. I was amazed that the guy didn't destroy them like most photographers did. He must have been a terrible pack rat to have kept 20,000 prints, including, if you look at them, some of them are just blank sheets of paper with a pencil line on them or a date on the back. And like there's nothing discernible in them, and yet he kept them. He kept everything. So I'm interested, if he kept them, then he obviously thought they were of some significance. And the least I could do is try and work out what that significance might be, not just for him, but for us. So in that sense, I think a lot of the kind of writing I do tries to close the loop between then and now. And this is just another example of that.
Hi, I want to just echo everyone's thanks. It's been great to read these pieces of the new book and this new piece, as well as to kind of sort of think about a lot of these issues in the context of your larger body of work. My question is about the hidden mother images and sort of thinking about these images in relation to the kind of political stakes of the book. I really appreciated your rationale for incorporating a discussion of these images into the book as a way of thinking about the sort of very sort of prominent to us mother figures sort of looming in the background of these images. And as a way of kind of thinking about obscure discourses about maternal desire or kind of parenting practices. And I appreciated your point that even the way we sort of named these images reflects our sort of desire to read them against the historical grain, that in the 19th century observers would have cared about the child. And then today we clearly see this kind of creepy figure in the background. I guess my question arises from your discussion of sort of interpretive frameworks that help close the loop between then and now, essentially kind of the distinction between what it might have been like to observe these images in the 19th century versus today. And I wonder, you point out that most of the children in these images are alive, and that is what's remarkable about them. There's a lot of work on kind of contemporary or on postmortem portraiture, and then certainly these hidden mother photographs, the focus kind of gets put onto the obscured figure. And I guess my question is whether the focus on the hidden mother in our sort of interpretive practice actually kind of turns the child into the element of the picture that's hiding in plain sight. For, as much as these figures are kind of obscured and we want to sort of think about their desires, sort of in the foreground is the child's desire to, for example, not sit still or not, sit for this image. And so I'm just wondering, like, do you think there's a way, like, how do we close this gap a little bit more and sort of think about both the kind of visible sitter and the obscured sitter sort of in closer dialogue with one another?
Yeah, I don't think we want to close the gap. I think maybe I don't press it strongly enough, Meredith, but I thought I tried to argue that what those types of photographs set up is a kind of flicker where your eye goes back and forth between the foreground and the background, the thing we're meant to see and the thing we're meant not to see, and that this is what's fascinating about them. But in terms of, I have to, of course, acknowledge, as the essay does, that I encounter them through the agency of a contemporary artist who, in fact, exhibited them at the Venice Biennale in an exhibition curated by Cindy Sherman. It's like bizarro land, and she had 1,000 of them, which I thought I never got to see, like so many exhibition catalogs. I wrote about an exhibition which I never got to see myself. But so this is one occasion where I was fortunate that I didn't really have to invent the compression of then and now, because a contemporary artist had already said to us, they mean something in the present, and here's 1,000 of them, and you have to look at them in an exhibition framed by none other than Cindy Sherman's presence. So I think they're fascinating images. I'm trying to suggest to you that that flicker that you're touching on is indeed part of their allure. Now, how people saw them in the 19th century, that's an interesting question, and it would be great to find letters, diaries, people referring to them. I have not myself encountered any such documents, but hopefully their publication first in the Nagler catalogue and now in this book will generate some more debate about them. Interestingly, they're most discussed online. There are quite a few blogs, websites and blogs and whatnot devoted to them, but usually not in very critical terms, I have to say. If you go and look at them, you'll be dismayed how people actually talk about them. And I tried to suggest, actually, they're really complicated conceptual objects for all the reasons that you're touching on here. And then I also mentioned, if you remember, there's a weird correspondence between the mother who's shrouded and the photographer in front of them, who would have equally been shrouded and who therefore becomes a hidden mother. And then there's Linda Nagler, who is the hidden mother that brings them to our attention, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a fascinating genre of photograph. And as I mentioned in the book, almost all of them are actually negatives, ambrotypes or tintypes, which are actually negatives. So that was my other excuse, Meredith, for including them. Yeah.
Thank you very warmly for presenting your book today and the Talbot manuscript.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you for hanging around and asking questions, and even more importantly, reading that stuff. And what I look forward to is everybody out there writing better stuff and forcing me to read it. So hopefully this is a generative conversation, and all of those people out there listening today will be inspired to do better than me. It wouldn't be that hard, really. Just start.
Hardly.
No, really.
Well, it's been excellent. Thank you again, Jeff. This has been a really productive conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.